True Crime Files of Los Angeles has taken on a new look. It's called Inside Story. We're talking about the criminal justice system and the law. There's a lot of things that have been going on over the last couple of years. A lot of criticism that the criminal justice system has received. And I worked with the courts for 43 years with the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office. So I really know how the courts operate. And yes, there are some improvements that are needed, but a lot of the blame that they're getting may not quite be merited. And as you know, the criminal justice system is made up of three parts. We have the law enforcement section, the police, the sheriff and all, and then we have the courts. Then after that, if the person's convicted, we have corrections. It could be jail, it could be prison, it could be probation. So there's a number of parts to the criminal justice system. So it's kind of hard to lump it all together, and when there's criticism, which section are you really concerned about? But one of the things that we have been getting for the last couple of years is people complaining, educate, don't incarcerate, build the people, not the jails. There's a lot of concern about incarcerating people, that we should rehabilitate and work from that standpoint. Well, when it comes to sentencing, there's a number of things that can be done. A person who's convicted, could get probation. It could be informal probation, it could be formal probation. They could be sentenced to county jail, or if it's serious enough, they could be sent to the state prison. So there's a number of options for a judge when it comes to sentencing. Now, talking about probation, most cases end up on probation. Generally, maybe a formal probation, where there's a probation officer who kind of oversees and supervises people who are on probation for the courts. And it works fairly well on the low-level type crimes. However, we have the state prisons that we're all familiar with, and especially in California. And the prisons take on many different looks. The tier system, a prison is a prison, and there's a lot of concern about incarcerating people for a number of reasons. One of the big reasons is it's expensive. Now, here this chart just kind of shows you somebody who's on probation, it maybe costs $4,000 per person per year. But if you have a person in prison, that's almost $60,000 to house that person. So there is a downside to incarceration. It can get very expensive. So what I want to do in this episode, and several episodes to follow, is talk about sentencing. Because so many people want to say, well, the courts are sentencing people to too long a time. They're incarcerating people unnecessarily. And when we talk about sentencing, there are four parts to it. And the first one is retribution, and we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about retribution. And the next podcast, we'll talk about deterrence. How is that important? Then following that, we'll talk about rehabilitation. And lastly, we'll talk about incapacitation, the ones that have to be taken out of society, incarcerated for the acts that they do. Now, I want to concentrate today on retribution. And, what is it? Some people think of it as the payback. A person, an offender who breaks the law should pay a price for that. And it could be punishment. Different types of punishment. It could be a fine. It could be probation or some jail time or, as we said, prison. So it's the old thing, retribution is eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But the important thing about retribution, we've had this always as form of punishment, it has to be appropriate to the crime. So that's what retribution is about. It's not just merely, throwing away the key, locking the person up. It has to be appropriate. Now, how do we determine that? Well, this is what we're going to talk about today. How do we decide what is the appropriate punishment for the crime that was committed and the defendant, the type of person, their background, and so forth? the easiest way to learn about sentencing is to look at specific cases. And as I say, I've been doing this for many, many years, and I'm going to talk about cases that I was involved in and use them as examples so that you get an idea. Now, the first one I want to talk about is, I call it the Mason case. It all starts out back in 1957. We have two El Segundo police officers who are patrolling, that's around midnight, and they see a car run a red light. And so they pull behind it, pull it over, and they're in the process of writing a citation for that individual. The person is standing in front of the police car. The two officers are out standing there on the side. He turns around and shoots both of them, kills both police officers right then and there. And then he escapes. He drives off, gets away. Well, they find the car that he was driving, and they find latent prints on the steering wheel. And there were two partial prints, but they weren't good enough to run through the database. So there was nothing that could be done, because back in those days, everything had to be done by hand. So we had two partial prints. Case went absolutely nowhere. Well, we know over a period of, let's say, I think it was 43 years, technology improved, and we have computers, and they were able to take those two latent prints and make a composite out of them. And that is something that they could run through the database. And I think a number of you have seen my podcasts on this case. Very, very interesting case, the Mason case. But it made a big difference, and we were able to track down who the person was with those prints. And it was a Gerald Mason in South Carolina. So now we knew who the killer was, and we were able to get him, and we prosecuted him. Now, who was he? Well, he was kind of a drifter back then, back in 57, 58. He'd been in state prison for a burglary, minor charge, but since then, he had come back to South Carolina, and he was a businessman. He owned a number of service stations, did very, very well, and was very prominent in the community in South Carolina. Well, we brought him back to California, and he was convicted, and he was sentenced. Now, the things, as far as sentencing, what should his sentence be? Tough decision. Here he was, a very outstanding family man. He was loved by his neighbors, good businessman, helped the community. He was very remorseful for what he had done 43 years earlier. So what should be the sentence in that type of case? Well, we know it was life. And he was put in a prison. Only thing he wanted was the prison be in South Carolina. It was worked out. He came up for parole, and it was denied. So he died in prison. He died after 43 years living a stellar life in prison. Well, was that good or not? Well, it depends how you're focused. If you're focused on the defendant, and he had done good things with his life, he had turned himself around, he was very productive for society. However, we had, I think it was either 5 or 6 children of those police officers who grew up without a father. Wow. So 46 years, boy, that is, what should we do in a situation like that? If we focused on the defendant, he most likely should have been given parole. If we focus on the 2 police officers' families, most likely we should have thrown away the key. So that gives you an idea of some of the issues that come up. And when we're talking about retribution, we need to know about the crime and about the individual. Now, the next case I want to talk about is the Kathleen Celaya case. And I think some of you remember my podcast on it. It involves Patty Hearst, the SLA, the Seminole Liberation Army. They were up in the Bay Area, and they wanted, I guess we'd call them urban terrorists. They wanted the poor people to get food, get money, be taken care of. And they felt that the government wasn't doing enough for them. So the idea was to get out there and be disruptive and force the governments to do more for the poor. Well, they were putting bombs in various police stations, civic centers, transit places, to scare people so they could get their way. And it wasn't working out, so they decided to come down to Los Angeles, put some bombs under the police cars in Los Angeles, and make it look like they're a big organization. Well, they weren't. They may have been, I don't know, 12, 15 urban terrorists, young kids who wanted to save the world. So they took these pipe bombs, they were 3-inch pipe bombs, and they put them under police cars in Los Angeles. And this is what it looked like. I mean, they had a clothespin with a wedgie in there, and when the police car would pull out, the magnet, that wedgie would come out, and the bomb would go off. Now, how dangerous were they? Very, very dangerous. It would obviously kill the police officers who were in the car, but it also would kill anybody who was in the general area. So there's very, very dangerous. But what happened is, in both cases, the one where the police officers were at this IHOP in Hollywood, they had turned their steering wheel real sharp, and in doing that, that clothespin got twisted, and when it closed, it didn't make contact. So that bomb didn't go off, and fortunately, LAPD then checked all their police cars, looked underneath all of them, and found another bomb under one of their detective cars out in Hollenbeck Station, East LA. So those were the bombs, and when they took them apart, those were the parts. They had shrapnel, meaning bullets, nails in there. They had the battery to set it off. Everything in both bombs were exactly the same. And when they arrested these bomb makers, these SLA members, they had their safe house up in San Francisco, and all the bomb making equipment was up there. So when they went into, they found it all when these people were arrested, and whose fingerprints were all over that bomb making material? It was Kathleen Celaya. Those are her latent prints. So now we know who was involved in it, and they try to go out to get her, but they can't find her. They arrest Patty Hearst. They arrest the Harrises. All these people got arrested except Kathleen Celaya. So nothing happens on the case. She's never brought in. She's never found. However, it was about 25 years later, they had a program, America's Most Wanted, and it was on the 25th anniversary of the SLA shootout in Los Angeles, and they had a photograph of Kathleen Celaya. Somebody in, I think it was Minnesota, they saw that photograph, and they said, boy, that looks like somebody familiar I know who that is. And they knew that person to be a Sarah Jane Olson. And LAPD went back there, they found her, and they found that was Kathleen Celaya. They arrested her and brought her back to California. Well, that's what happened on the case. We came and got her, we convicted her, and the judge had to sentence her. Now, what should her sentence be? Well, it was how many years? 25 years that she had been back there in Minneapolis, Minnesota. She was a stellar member of the community. She married the head of the ER in Minneapolis. She had several daughters who grew up, were excellent students, and she was very active in the different plays that were put on in the community. So what type of person was she for those 25 years? I guess you'd say a stellar member of the community. So should that be taken into account? Should that be weighed when deciding on the sentence? Well, it came down that she was given 14 years in state prison. Now, if you were focused on her, you might say, that's too harsh, that's too much. And if he were focused on those police officers who fortunately were not killed, but just luckily survived that, well, maybe that was the appropriate sentence. So what I'm trying to say, retribution requires you to give what is a proper sentence under the crime and as to the individual. So that's the Celaya case, which kind of gives you a good example of that. There's another one that I'm very familiar with, and that's the Mickey Thompson case. Now, he was a race driver, and he was the fastest man on wheels. And eventually he got into stadium racing. Did very, very well with that. Eventually, Mickey Thompson, he was leaving for work in the morning with his wife, Trudy, and they came out and they were shot and killed in their driveway. Wow. Who could have done it? Why did they do it? Now, the neighbors looked around and they saw two men leaving on bicycles. And they went down this route through the Bradbury Estate area, and they came out to the street, and they were seen there. Back at the location, some of the neighbors said, you know, Mickey had mentioned to us that if anything ever happened to him or Trudy, that they should look at his ex-partner, his ex-business partner. And so they had that information, but when they talked to the witnesses, they found that the two people who they saw do the shooting were black males, young black males. Wow. And the business partner, he was not black at all. And he had an alibi. He was down in Costa Mesa in a gym. So it wasn't him. So here this case, you know, a very serious case of two people being killed in a very prominent area of Los Angeles, and there's no scientific evidence, nothing. There are no suspects. What's going to happen? The case doesn't get solved at all. And what we do know from it is that there were lawsuits between Mickey Thompson and his partner, Goodwin, Michael Goodwin. Yes, there was a lot of hatred, rivalry between the two of them, but there wasn't anything to prove that the ex-partner did it. It wasn't until all of a sudden, you know, it's a cold case, been there for like 12 years, and then a new detective is assigned to the case, and he goes through the file, and he's looking for any names or any, comes across a name and sees that it wasn't followed up with. He contacts that individual. Now, that person had moved to another state, calls up and says, hey, what did you see? And he said, yeah, you know, a day before, or 2 days before Mickey Thompson was killed, I saw somebody scoping out the area just below his house. The person had binoculars on, and I thought it was very suspicious. And my wife and I saw it. I said, well, could you identify? Yeah, I think I could identify. They showed him pictures of a group of people, and he picked out the photo of the ex-partner of Goodwin. So now they have the case reopened. Now they start going through it and see, can they make the case? Well, that was crucial evidence that they had put together on this neighbor down the street. It turned the case around. We were able to make a case. We got him convicted. Goodwin was convicted. Wow. What his sentence should be. Now, remember that case was delayed like 12 years because the police had not followed up on everything they should have. Now, as to the suspect, the defendant, Goodwin, should he get the benefit of that the police did not track him down as quickly as they should have? And it ended up, it took 18 years by the time we were able to get him convicted. Now, his sentence was life without the possibility of parole. Now, is that the proper sentence for him? Should it have been different, less than that? Well, you're going to have to decide. So that is the Mickey Thompson one, kind of one that you'd not have a great deal of sympathy for the defendant, but on the other hand, it wasn't him that the case was delayed. It was because the police hadn't tracked him down. Anyway, I want to talk about two additional cases that you have to consider when you're trying to determine what is appropriate. And I want to talk about, I call it the Black Widow case. It's the Golay Ruddersmith case. Helen Golay, I think she was 77, and Ruddersmith, she was something like 75. Very elderly ladies, and they wanted to help the homeless. And what they would do is they'd go to the homeless shelters and find men that needed help, and they would pay for motels, for them to stay at motels. Or they would get apartments for them. They would feed them. They would take care of these men for like 2 years. But they always wanted the men to feel good about themselves, and they would take out life insurance policies on the men's lives. And they would put themselves down as fiance or a cousin or something like that. And so that was what they did. Now, what we know about the life insurance companies is that they will not contest life insurance policy after 2 years. And the women knew that. So they would wait 2 years, and in the meantime, they would take all of these life insurance policies out. And you're going to say, well, one or two or so forth. No, dozens and dozens of life insurance policies with different companies. So all these companies did not know that another insurance company had a case out on that individual. So after 2 years, that individual was found dead in an alley of an apparent hit and run. It appeared that, here's this homeless man who was run over in an alley. Those women would go in to get the police report and take it in, send it to the insurance company. And you're saying, well, maybe they made a few dollars on it. It was like $1.5 million on this one, and a huge number. So yes, it was very, very profitable for them. Now, we prosecuted the case. They were convicted, but the defense that Helen Golay, she said, oh, it couldn't have been me. I didn't do it. I'm too frail. And it must have been my daughter. My daughter may have done it. She was the one that bought the car that ran over him. Well, it was kind of interesting. The jury listened to it all. They were both found guilty of premeditated murder as well as conspiracy to commit murder. Now, it was interesting what the judge said at the time of sentencing. He said, these unfortunate men were sacrificed on your altars of greed. And he gave both of them life without the possibility of parole. Well, what would be the appropriate sentence? What is the appropriate sentence in this case? Well, they're elderly. By this time, they're up in their 80s. If they are given probation, are they going to be harmful to anybody in society? No. Are they likely to commit more killings? No. So if you focus on the individuals, these elderly, like 80-year-old women, they don't need to be in prison. Society will be safe without them in prison. But they're given life without the possibility of parole. Now, some of you are going to think that's too harsh. Others of you are going to say, well, maybe they deserved it in what they did. Because when you talk about premeditation, what could be more premeditated than helping a homeless person for 2 years, knowing that you are going to run over them? So, sentencing has to take in many factors. I want to move on to the one last case, and that is the Phil Spector case. I did a lot of work on that case. Who was Phil Spector? Most of you know who he was. He was the Wall of Sound. He is the one that created that sound that we all enjoyed. He had the Crystals, the Ronettes, the Righteous Brothers, Lost That Loving Feeling. We all know the songs. He did the Beatles, Let It Be, and Ike and Tina Turner. Very, very, he was a genius when it came to music. But one thing that he liked to go out and meet young women, and he went to the House of Blues, and he met Lana Clarkson there. She was working there, and he talked to her a while. She was an actress. She did the Barbarian Queen. 2 series of that. Very attractive, very tall. And he talked her into, hey, come over to my house for a drink. Just one drink. Come on. And she said, okay, I'll do it. I'll come over for a drink. And goes out to his castle in Alhambra and goes to, the living room there. They talk, and maybe a little kissy face goes on there. But she's tired. She doesn't want to do any more of this. She wants to leave. And she goes to the foyer and sits down in this chair. Now, he wanted to have sex with her. She didn't want to do it. And he had a custom of always pulling out a gun if a woman did not comply with his wishes, and threatened her. Most women went along with it. They didn't want to get shot, so they complied. However, for some reason, Lana said, no, I won't do it. He takes that gun, sticks it in her mouth, and pulls the trigger. Kills her. She's instantly killed right then and there. And there was a chauffeur that was just outside there. He hears the shot, and he sees Phil Spector step out that door and say, I think I killed somebody. Wow. Okay, so he's prosecuted. And what should happen? What should be the sentencing of that? He's convicted. It took us 6 years to get him convicted. But the judge gave him 19 years in state prison. Now you're going to say, if we focus on him, he's up there in the 80s, early 80s. He was a genius. He had contributed to the music world. Well, maybe we should give him some slack. Maybe the sentence should be appropriate. And if we're thinking about retribution, maybe it should be less than 19 years. Now, some of you, on the other hand, are going to look at it differently. And you're going to say, no, he deserved what he got. So anyway, today we talked about retribution as part of the sentencing. And I think you can see it isn't easy to determine what is the appropriate sentence. So next podcast, we're going to talk about deterrence. I think you're going to find that fascinating as well. Then the following podcast will be on rehabilitation. What a lot of you are interested in. You want to see more rehabilitation. And is that possible? And the last one of the podcasts on sentencing will be incapacitation, meaning taking that person out of society because they're too harmful. So I hope you found this interesting on sentencing. This is True Crime Files of Los Angeles, Inside Story. Hope to see you again.